Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. The Association for Public Policy Education welcomes you to this webinar. And as most of you know here, from all the publicity that we have done to bring you here, that the association was created with the primary objective to advance and strengthen the discipline and the practice of public policy education in India by leveraging the strength of the public policy schools and institutions in India. As we probably know, that many of the schools in the country pioneer in public service values by emphasizing the importance of public in public policy by keeping citizens at the center of public policy. The life in most of this school and institution aims to promote leadership, transparency, and accountability in governance and encouraging scholars, individuals to pursue careers that contribute to public good and to also recognize the role of markets in solving societal problems. Public policy schools play a crucial role in shaping the future of governance, public administration, and public policy. Once again, good afternoon, friends, those who are joining in still. On behalf of the Association for Public Policy Education and the Center for Public Policy Research, the Kochi-based think tank, I, Manoj, have the privilege of welcoming you to the webinar on the topic, how is public policy education relevant for the country and its citizens? The webinar primarily, we hope, will facilitate the conversation with the key stakeholders gathered here and all of you present on three most important areas. Why is public policy education vital to address governance challenges and improve government efficiency in India? That's number one. Number two, how are institutions contributing, when I mention institutions or the schools today in India, contributing to equipping public policy leaders? And the third is, how is public policy education relevant for the country and its citizens? So I have the joy to introduce the moderator and the panelist of the hour. Professor Sudarshan, who will be our moderator, has a distinguished career in the domains of research, development, programming, and governance. After decades of working in the UN in 2012, he joined the OP Jindal Global University, and as the founding dean of the Jindal School for Government and Public Policy, his research and publications reflect interdisciplinary research, teaching and policy experience in development programs, human development, law, governance, institutions, and policy. Thank you, Professor Sudarshan. We have our two panelists. I will introduce Anupam Manur, who is the assistant professor at Takshashila Institution. Anupam teaches economics, reasoning, and macroeconomics at the institution, public policy programs, and he is responsible for designing the curriculum for the educational programs at the institution. Thank you, Anupam, for coming this afternoon. Dr. Parth Shah is our other panelist, is the Dean and F.A. Hayek Professor of Spontaneous Order at the Indian School of Public Policy. Parth is the founder president at CCS, Center for Civil Society. Dr. Shah's research and advocacy focuses on themes of economic freedom, choice, competition in education, property rights, and approach for environment and the good governance. With this, I would like to welcome Parth, Anupam, and Professor Sudarshan. I would ask Professor Sudarshan to go ahead with the webinar facilitation. Enjoy the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manoj. And it's great to be with Parth and Anupam in this session. So compliments to the Association for Public Policy Education for organizing this. This ought to be one of many such conversations that we ought to have to reach a large number of people. And that's because public policy has been, for decades, it's been assumed that it's something that only those who join the government need concern themselves with. And unlike the United States, where public policy education has had a long history, and all the Ivy League institutions have had schools of public policy. In many parts of the world, that's not the case. The reason public policy has been long-standing has to do with the kind of government that the United States and the states that constitute the United States of America has had, which is that every time at any level of government, local government, state, or the federal government, when the political leaders change, they bring with them, when they assume office, people at the policy-making level. So the policy-making echelon of the U.S. civil service is not permanent. It will change with who happens to be the president, or who happens to be the governor of a state, or even the mayor of a city. And therefore, it's been a long tradition in the USA. No matter what walk of life you're in, you could be an astronaut, you could be a chemist, you could be a doctor. People thought it's a good idea to acquire a degree in public policy because they may be at some point called upon to serve a government at any of these levels. And that's why you'd find that a lot of people, no matter what their background discipline is or the primary area of specialization is, would still seek to have a qualification in public policy. But that's not been the case in countries other than the United States, which are part of the British Empire, because most of them have the permanent civil service. And it's been assumed that only those who are members of the permanent civil service need worry about public policy. And many of you would have seen the satire on permanent civil servants guiding their ministers about public policy in that wonderful series, Yes, Minister and Yes, Prime Minister. And though it is satirical, it's also very true, the episodes that people have thought up there. And it's clear then that a permanent civil service constituted by generalists who have a lot of valuable field experience, no doubt, but if they try to make policy, then there are serious challenges. And so one reason we need to get away from this monopoly over policy making of those already in government is that the world has become very complex. It's not the case that someone who served 3 years as Secretary Rural Development will serve for the next 3 years in charge of the Department of Space and so on. So there's a growing understanding that the complexity in the world and the challenges require government to open up. So it's not as if we've drastically changed the way policy making is done in the country, but one important development is governments understand now that they don't know all the answers. And they have to reach out and tap expertise from outside the government in order to be able to make policy. And the reason why government is involved in policy is because in order to enforce a policy, you need the backing of law. So in all societies that have a rule of law system, you need to have the policy enacted or the policy captured in some form of law. It could be an executive order, a gazette notification. It could be a statute passed by a legislature. It could be an ordinance because the executive has lawmaking powers. But whatever it is, it's got to have the backing of law. Otherwise, you can't impose it on citizens. And therefore, government is needed. It's not that, government is needed for everything and it's the be all and end all, not at all. But ultimately, it has to have the form of a law. But how you make the policy is the point. And in making law and translating policy into law, there's a lot of challenges. And so, there's a saying that, war is too important to be left to the generals alone. And we've now come to the realization that public policy is much too important to be left to a cadre of policymakers at the local, state, or the union government levels in this country. And there's, at one point, Professor Raj Krishna was a well-known political scientist, used to say, half in jest only, that the government of India is knowledge proof, just as watches are waterproof. And what's happened now is that's changed. There's a realization that government needs external assistance to mobilize evidence, to analyze evidence, and to try to make policies on the basis of evidence. Nonetheless, the question is, how far have governments gone down that line? And so I'd like to begin by asking our two panelists, Parth, to start off. Why should anyone learn or get a qualification in public policy when there are so many other disciplines, conventional disciplines like economics and political science and sociology and so on, which are, or even old-fashioned public administration, which universities have been teaching. But that's more about how the government is structured and how do you actually implement a policy, but that's not about so much about how do you formulate or design policies. So my question is, when you say public policy is about what you need to know to formulate, design, and implement policies that will deliver, that will be implementable. Because one common saying in India is, our policies are good, but implementation is bad. But that's actually a nonsensical statement, because no policy can be called good unless it is implementable and implemented and achieves its results or its aims. So with that background, I'd like to invite Parth to say a few words about, why is this now relevant? Or why can't India carry on as before, relying on the, highly competitively selected Indian Administrative Service to make our policies?
Thank you, Sudarshan. And also thank you to APPE for setting this up. I think, as you know, I have been a great champion of an association of this kind. But there are many policy schools coming up across the country. And of course, there are think tanks which have been training people in public policy. I think it's important for us to come together, both in terms of how do we look at the training of public policy, the pedagogy of public policy, and of course, how do we influence the outside world to have them understand the importance of the graduates and the trainees that we have and why they are going to play an important role in the nation building process. Right. I think to answer your question, Sudarshan, I would say there are two ways of looking at it. One, which is very narrowly defined, narrow way of looking at it would be to say that public policy addresses problems which are at the junction of Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar. Right. So today, I think all challenges that we face, from climate change to economic growth, right, or economic development, there are problems which cannot be solved by any one part of our society. They cannot be solved by Sarkar alone, cannot be solved only by the private sector, by the bazaar, and certainly cannot be solved by the Samaj, the civil society. Right. So I think we are in a situation where we need to have all three working together. And public policy, in my view, is a sort of domain, discipline, training sort of format that prepares you to understand the importance of each of these entities, Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar, and also understand limitations of those entities and see which one of them or which combination of them is best prepared or is best suited to address the challenge that we want to address, right? So I think one big reason for public policy today, and I think as you very well pointed out, there's a huge demand for public policy training in the country, both from students on one hand and also from the government on the other, right? So that's one sort of quick way of thinking about public policy. In a broader way, I think, is also what I think Manoj referred to in his opening remarks about role of markets. So I know that, after 1991 reforms, and of course, what has happened since then, there's a lot better understanding of what role markets can play, what role even civil society can play in addressing some of the very deep-rooted problems that we have, right? I think that understanding is there, but at the same time, I don't really see that kind of engagement that we need to have with the market process and with the markets being made to address some of these perennial challenges still there. So I think my Baap Sarkar syndrome that we have been complaining about for a long time, right, still somewhat sort of pursues, continues in that sense. So it's an interesting paradox of government expectations. So you meet people in the drawing room, they all complain about how bad the government is, right? The moment you put a problem on the table, how do we address this problem? The only answer that you get is government again, right? So I think that's an interesting paradox that we still, I think, in a sense, suffering from in the country. And hopefully public policy education particularly could address some of that and create a deeper understanding of what Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar can do together.
Thank you very much. So Anupam, your perspective on this.
Hey, yeah. Thanks everyone for having me over. I broadly agree with what Parth has said, but I'm going to just focus on one aspect of this, which is what we can call as the governance challenge. We're seeing that obviously as economic growth propels India towards middle income country. We have to understand that the structures, processes, and ideas of governance keep pace with this kind of economic growth. Our challenges today are fundamentally different from the challenges that we faced even a decade ago, right? So there is very clearly what we can think of as a governance gap. And this governance gap is between what individuals expect, what citizens of India aspire to be, and where the government is at in terms of capacity to deliver on those aspirations. So I think I can take multiple examples of this. I mean, India, for example, is no longer, we can't say that India lives in its villages anymore. We are largely an urban country now. We can't say agriculture is the backbone of Indian economy. It's not. I mean, agriculture now contributes, I think, 14% of GDP, though it employs a lot more. We often try and govern new age apps and institutions and companies the way that we used to govern them maybe 100 years back. I mean, for instance, I think Uber and Ola today is still governed by a Stage Carriage Act, how you basically govern horse carriages. I can think of examples in the labor field. I mean, our labor laws are still stuck in 1800s, right? I mean, there are laws which says that you should have spittoons and so on for labor laws. I can give 100 million examples such as this, right? So I think sometimes the governance in India has not caught up with the state of the economy, the state of technology, the aspirations of the people. And so therefore, that's creating a governance gap. So where I think we come in is this, that to close that governance gap, you require talented individuals, of course, but talented individuals to be equipped with the right ideas, competencies, and networks. So this is, I mean, we can think of how this can be possible, right? So to begin with, and I'm going to pick off on one particular strand that, let's say, that Parth introduced, which is on government or expectations of the government. And I'll probably even make this broader and say, what is the role of the state, right? And I think to begin with, there is fundamental kind of misunderstanding / confusion on what the role of the state is. And this confusion / misunderstanding exists from within the government and outside of it. To begin with, I think we would say, and I'm sure, I can almost presume that Parth will agree with me on this, that the role of the state is just on contract enforcement, property rights, or enforcement of property rights, things like, of course, addressing market failures at best, right? So that's the role of the state. Yet we find that, this Indian state is a paradox. The Indian state is far too big in places where it is not required, right? This can be in terms of, the various things that it produces, whether it is running banks or running insurance companies, or until very recently running aeroplanes. And of course, it is a monopoly on the railways. It does a whole bunch of things. Karnataka government produces soap still. I have no reason why that it does. And so therefore, I think the scarce kind of capacity that the government has, it spends on things that it should not be doing. And the other kind of part of this is that it also interferes a little bit too much in our day-to-day lives, right? From what we should eat to how should we dress to what we should be doing, all of that, right? So the government is too big in all of these things. But also, crucially, and this is the paradox, it's far too small in places where it should be at. So as I said, things like contract enforcement, it's very small. Justice and law enforcement, we know that, for example, the number of policemen to, let's say, the population ratio in India is one of the lowest in comparable countries. We find that the pendency in court cases is just one of the highest in the world, right? Which is why, you can't get things done. We know, for example, property rights. Even the government can take your property sometimes at very short notice. So on all of these things where the government has to be big, where state capacity has to be big, it's actually, it's quite small, right? Even things like correcting sometimes externalities and so on, you find that the government is too small on this. So I think that is the fundamental kind of paradox of the Indian state. Now, the second part is, even where it's supposed to be doing things, I think far too often you find that the Indian, again, government misdiagnoses the problem, right? So it's not able to identify and diagnose the problem correctly. If we say that one of the things that the government should be doing is to correct market failures, I think far too often we get this wrong. We try and correct for failures where none exists. If you look at the water scarcity problem in India and Bangalore, for example, what is going on now, you'll find that's a classic case. We've priced water far too cheaply, thinking that water is a public good. It's not a public good, right? Economic literature tells us that water is a pure form private good. You can think of multiple such examples where the government imagines a problem sometimes, tries to solve for it, ends up being too big, ends up intervening in the market, completely distorting the market. You can think of MSP, you can think of how that leads to water crisis, for example. You can think of free electricity that we give and how that leads to a whole set of problems. So I think in many of these things, the fundamental, the issue arises in a misdiagnosis of the problem. That misdiagnosis of the problem results in erroneous kind of decisions. The third part, and I'll end after this, is the solution. Even if we somehow diagnose the problem, we end up with wrong set of solutions. We use the wrong tools to correct those solutions. So if we think that something is truly harmful, let's say that we might agree that excessive alcohol actually has public health problems. What do? We go ahead and ban it, like we have done in Bihar. And we should realize by now that bans don't work. We don't have, neither is it correct in a moral kind or ethical sense, because it's impinging on individual freedoms. But it's also wrong in the sense that we don't have the state capacity to deliver on those things. So bans don't work. Neither do price controls. Far too often we think, okay, price is high, and the underlying problem of why that price might be high could, in all probability, end up with a kind of mistaken government policy. We end up issuing price controls. Price controls will lead to, shortages and excesses. Price controls can lead to, black markets. It results in a whole set of problems by itself. Or sometimes government will do a do-it-yourself, right? Which is a massive waste of resources. It runs canteens on its own. I find no reason why government should be running food canteens. Or we do mistargeted subsidies, which creates perverse incentives and moral hazard problems. So, this is a set of, we far too often have the wrong solution for a misdiagnosed problem in a position that the state should not even be in the first place. So for me, that is the kind of diagnosis of where things go wrong in India far too often. And so how can this be solved? And this is where I think public policy education comes in. I think if you have a talented set of people who understand these issues at the kind of the supply side, what I call as a supply side, that is people within government, people within the capacity to kind of influence government policies. You need people who understand these issues really well. But you also need really, you need an engaged citizenry. You need a set of people on the demand side who can ask for the right things from the government, who will demand for the right things from the government, not only ask for subsidies or not only ask for freebies and so on. So I think public policy education is crucial both from the supply side and the demand side. And that's where, policy education institutions are coming up. They're coming up in a big way in India. And this is the kind of revolution that you're seeing in policy education that perhaps US saw in the 60s, 70s. So we are about 40, 50 years back, but we're clearly seeing that, there's a clear uptake. So I'll stop there for a moment and we can get back to any of these things at a later point.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a very good diagnosis of the challenges and the problems that we have with governance, as you correctly put it. But the question really is that if you are a young person with a choice of having done an undergraduate degree, say in some subject, and you are thinking about. So many people think that if they are interested in public policy, they assume that they have to go through the gruel and the challenge of appearing in the union public service exams. Hordes of them are going to these institutions that say they will train them to pass these exams. That whole thing, people are killing themselves in quota, trying to crack the UPSC. This seems to be a very tragic charade because this is about a flawed system of learning and education. It's about a system that's based on rote learning, on mugging up and regurgitating facts, which in this day and age, you can summon up and get at the click of one button. And so the whole thing is crazy. And young people are forcing themselves because, see, they have an idealism. They think they should make life better for people. They wish to serve people. And if they are that way idealistic, they want to join government and they suffer this UPSC hurdle. So then they ask the question, well, if that's not going to be, and the more intelligent among them would say that the probability of them, particularly if they're actually intelligent, getting and cracking the civil service exams is going to be very small. Then they're going to ask the question, if I do a degree in public policy, how am I to make a living? It's all very well to say enlightened citizenry. I will be part of an enlightened citizenry. I will know exactly how the government misdiagnoses the problem, or then it has the wrong solutions. I am well informed about these things, but how am I going to, earn my daily livelihood? What are the jobs that are out there? These are concerns that young people quite legitimately have. And so in that respect, I wanted both of you to spell out a little bit about, it's true that the big corporations now, whether it's Alphabet, which owns Google, or Facebook, or X, which was formerly Twitter, all of them have public policy divisions, and they employ people who can analyze from the point of view of the business, what are the implications of public policy, help the government, or you might call it advocacy, which is a good word. You might call it lobbying, which in India is a bad word, but in the United States is an accepted word. So there are some opportunities of that kind. But the concern really is that on the one hand, I mentioned that the government seems to be opening up, but not quite. I mean, there was this much hype about lateral entry and how, capable, talented people with great domain knowledge can be brought into government. And it's very likely that, they are socialized into behaving and becoming like the regular civil servant, rather than being the kind of creative and innovative person they were before they were laterally sucked into government. So there is that challenge. So I wanted you to reflect upon, if you were addressing young people and trying to tell them, why is it that they should do a degree in public policy or get educated in public policy, how are they going to make a living? So can we start with you, Anupam, and go in the reverse order?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I mean, so this is a standard spiel that we give to our students. I think I have it covered by and large. This is a very interesting question, and obviously probably the most relevant one for people who are listening into this conversation as a young student. And I just want to make probably one observation that, when I joined Takshashila all the way back in 2015, in the first couple of years, I used to always say, that public policy is a sunrise industry, that it's just coming up. There are opportunities here and there. But given maybe past 2021, 22, I've stopped saying that it's a sunrise industry. I think it's very much now I could say that it's almost getting well established, that there are lots of career opportunities in public policy, and that makes it, for me, a very exciting domain to be in. Being in public policy now is probably like if you were in the IT industry in Bangalore in 1996, 97. It's just on the cusp of that kind of taking off. And it's, or maybe slightly later than that, but that's where it's interesting. But let me now break it down into its constituent parts. You didn't mention corporates, and I want to probably elaborate on that. Corporates are big recruiters of public policy professionals, because now you find that a lot of corporate entities can have their businesses either soar or destroyed overnight due to a good or bad policy by the government, which means that they need to have an army sometimes of policy professionals who are not only anticipating government policy, but are also able to respond to it, mitigate some of the effects of those policies, and maybe even perhaps have a way in shaping those policies. So as I said, I mean, I took an example of something like, let's say cab aggregators, and that every single state government, for example, are creating policies which will affect the way that cab aggregators deploy. So whether it is in terms of, whether there is share or pool, or whether bikes can provide some of these services, etc. And sometimes, you have a government policy which can change these things dramatically. So you have these companies, for example, who have quite a large team of policy professionals who are, as I said, who are trying to anticipate some of these things, shape some of these things, mitigate the bad effects of some of these things. And I think that's important. So I think now pretty much every single big company in India operating, which can be affected by kind of public policy, will have a policy team, whether it is, whether it is automobile companies, new age, of course, all forms of internet companies, because they have, I think the impact there is a lot more, e-commerce websites to, cab aggregators, to even sometimes old school companies are now having policy professionals on their teams to deal with this. So I think that is a very exciting opportunity. And if you're as a policy professional in some of these things, and then there's corporates who are doing political or policy consulting. So earlier, your big consulting groups would have only political consulting to look at political risk in terms of this government changes, that government changes. But now you're having teams which look at policy risk. Can a policy be reversed? Can a policy, what are the chances that you can have a new policy which can, throw out some of the businesses? So I think you also have the big four and others consulting groups who are hiring policy professionals. Advocacy groups, as you said, I think it's a very important thing. You have a large variety of advocacy groups for individual rights. You have advocacy groups for something like internet, freedom. You have advocacy groups that will go after privacy. There's a whole bunch of advocacy groups who, again, need policy professionals because they have to deal with the government. They have to deal with the government on a day-to-day basis. They have to sometimes, again, anticipate government policies. Then you have think tanks. That's again, a kind of big recruiter of policy professionals. So you have think tanks who are working on policy research, who will hire people who can do those research, who can then convert that research into also maybe, disseminate some of that information, disseminate some of that research into the field. So I think there are quite a few think tanks, but I would only imagine that the number of think tanks as we go ahead will increase, and you'll have much more specific. I mean, if you remember, something like Takshashila is still a slightly broad-based think tank. We have, multiple verticals, but I think you will, CPPR is also quite a broad-based kind of think tank. As we go ahead, you'll also begin to see more niche kind of think tanks, right, on specific areas that they will work in. NGOs also require policy professionals, and they're hiring, and they also pay, by the way. I mean, I think we have to get rid of the notion that working in think tanks or NGOs don't pay as much. I think newer age NGOs have funding. They want to get good policy professionals, and so they will hire people. Media is another engagement. I think one of the things that we've found, we've done quite a few, executive programs for media houses, because they come to us and say, we have reporters who understand, who know how to write, but they don't understand the policy context. So I think that's one area where policy professionals are required. Government is hiring. I know I'm speaking quite a bit, so I'll wrap up very quickly. Government is hiring both directly in terms of, government have their own think tanks, whether it's Niti Aayog, RBI has 2 or 3 think tanks, just to give you examples, who are dealing with some of these things, right? So, and then the lateral hires, yes, that's been a bit of a disappointment, but, again, one can hope. Political consultation is one final area. So you have companies which run now manifestos, which run political campaigns, which help in designing manifestos. All of these, again, require policy professionals who can put up forward these ideas. I've not gone very deep into some of these things, but I'll stop here again.
Thank you. That's quite a big canvas, and it's a very optimistic scenario out there. So, Parth, you've been, a champion of, civil society, and the importance of, civil society in governance. So how would you motivate or persuade young people to spend a little part of their education on public policy? For what reasons would you give them?
I think Anupam has really his skill down very well. So I think, as he said, he's ready to give this answer to whoever would ask where the jobs are. I think that's an important consideration for anyone who wants to think about public policy. At the end of the day, if you are not from a wealthy family, you need to find a way to support yourself, right? And that also is, I think, key constraint that we see in politics, right? So if you want to join politics, not just public policy, but also politics itself, that is a really key constraint. How do you support yourself while you engage in that endeavor, right? I think Anupam talked about the outside government. Actually, one of the motivations for starting Indian School of Public Policy was also our work at the Center for Civil Society with the government. So whenever we would go and sit with the minister in education or a skilling ministry or any other ministry, right, you would see that people who are sitting around the table, some of them are, of course, the civil servants and permanent employees of the government, but quite a few of them are consultants. Often when I leave the meeting, the summary of the meeting, what are the next steps that the minister or secretary wants to undertake, right? They're all being sent out by a consultant, right? So I saw, I'm sure we have also a lot of critique of what's going on in government through private sector consultants who are making, in some sense, policies themselves, right? So I saw there's a lot of input in the government process, not just in terms of informing and putting options on the table, but also I think in terms of deciding in many cases, what are the right choices for government to follow, right? And all of that work being done by private sector consultants, right? And I realized, and of course, this also came from many of the secretaries that we worked with, that, if I have a great person with an MBA degree, right? He can make great sort of secondary research. I ask him to look around for good skilling programs around the world. That guy can figure out what those are, put together a nice presentation for me. But beyond that, that person is not of much value, right? How do I convert those ideas, those programs that I identify around the world, which are quite relevant, quite effective? How do I translate those ideas into India, right? In the Indian context, in the constraints that, of course, particularly governance constraints that Anupam talked about, that India has across the board at all tiers of government. And so I think I realized, and so did my co-founder, Luis Miranda, that this really is a great opportunity, not just to create employment or job options, but also I think play an important role in the nation building process, right? So these are the decisions the government would have to take. There is no two-bit about it. And if we are able to help government to make better and more informed choices when they decide public policies, that could go a long way. So that was part of our motivation for starting Indian School of Public Policy. I think the way I have been talking about why public policy is important, in addition to the point that Anupam raised, is also making distinction between what I call direct action, acting directly to solve a problem, and what I call policy action, right? Like I have a classic example that I use, which probably would make sense also to the audience we have. So two of the famous sort of civil society women of India, right, are Medha Patkar and Anuna Roy, right? And if you look at their journey, just in the civil society space that they have undertaken for last, now almost more than 30 years, right? You see very interesting distinction between the approach they have taken. So Medha Patkar, of course, goes right to every affected area. It could be an affected forest area, could be a dam being built, could be a road being constructed, and agitates for the people who are going to be affected by that new project that's coming up and trying to get them a better deal in the process, right? And of course, he has to go from site to site. Right? He was there in, of course, as you know, many of the places. And her approach is what I call direct action. Agitate on the ground, put the pressure on the system, and hopefully bring about a change for that particular project, for that group of people who are affected by it, right? While if you look at the approach that Anuna Roy has taken, so even though in many cases she started with the direct action approach, very similar to Medha Patkar, I think quite often she realized soon that that's not an approach that will solve the problem at scale, right? I cannot be at every site which is affected, and for every group of people who are affected by those multiple projects which are coming up across the country, by government as well as by private sector, right? Both are actually equally important. And so Anuna Roy's approach has been policy action. So a campaign for right to information, right, was a street-led campaign on the street, on the ground, but ultimately she realized that it cannot continue that way. It has to be converted into a policy. And that's how we got Right to Information Act, right? And many of us, I think, worked along with her in some of those areas. Right? So I think that's the important way to understand the distinction between direct action and policy action, and why whatever you want to do, of course, may require direct action to begin with, but ultimately you would not be successful, you would not be able to solve the problem at scale until and unless you take policy action, right? And I end my sort of presentation by question to the audience that you have to figure out what's the Anuna Roy solution of policy action for the Medha Patkar problem, right? Which we have not yet solved, unfortunately.
Well, thank you. The other point I wanted to bring up in this context is that public policy education is inherently interdisciplinary. In other words, it's not multidisciplinary. Multidisciplinary means that you are learning many disciplines. In my case, it was all sequential. I did economics, then I did political science, and I did constitutional law. I had the luxury of, or the luck of scholarships, and educated in 5 universities, and so on, and became the academic equivalent of the idle rich for a long time. That's not open to most people. So multidisciplinary is not the public policy. It is inherently interdisciplinary in that for every policy problem, you have different facets from which you have to look at the problem. It will have a political dimension for sure. It will have an economic dimension for sure, because it will have money implications. But it will also have psychological, social, cultural implications. Just as human beings are not just the economic man and the political person, but we are all this is bundled together, and public policy is about people. And so you have to get insights from multiple disciplines that have a bearing on a problem which a policy is meant to address and tackle. And that's the essence of public policy education. I often mention that, we need to get to a culture of using this multi perspectives, addressing a problem. Say, take COVID, for instance. The epidemiologists would tell you that in the face of a very contagious danger like the virus, interpersonal human contact should be minimized. That's one perspective. But many governments around the world, including ours, went by that one perspective. We said, let's, close down the country, stop all transport, everything, stay at your home. And we had this lockdown. Now, if you'd only think about it, if you had consulted a historian, the historian would have said, when there was the plague in Bombay, what did the administration do? It told the people, everyone who's capable of getting out of Bombay, go somewhere, find a relative, find a friend, somewhere outside the city, go away there, decongest the city to the maximum extent. And the administration then laid on additional buses and trains to get people out. That's a lesson of history. We forgot. If you consulted demographers, they would have told you, how is the population of the country distributed? How many people are actually in their homes that they can shut themselves down and say, we are not going to go out? We forgot that there are millions and millions of people not in their own homes. And then you shut down whatever it is they are doing, the construction activity or the factory work. And then what are they meant to do? Then if you consult a psychologist, they'll say, when you face a danger like COVID, you want to be with your family. You don't want to be alone, removed far away. And so what happened? We witnessed a spectacle of people trying to walk home back to their villages. Public transport was shut down, all because the epidemiologist and the epidemiological perspective prevailed over that particular policy. So it's important then, as we go forward, that we understand that this is the only way. The public policy education is the only way right now in an education system which is bound by the silos of disciplines. Oh, I'm an economist, I'm not interested in politics. Oh, I'm a sociologist, so I'm not concerned about, the budget. This attitude's got to go. And public policy education is the only thing that would give you a chance to get valuable insights from multiple disciplines and to be able to use practical judgment in whatever it is. I mean, we make policies all the time. We make policies at home. How much television should our child watch? That's policy. This is why I think we need to encourage students to understand that one valuable way for overcoming the silos of disciplines and the narrowness of those disciplines is to get a qualification of public policy education, because that genuinely broadens and opens up the minds of people, and it draws all of the great benefits that research and social science knowledge can bring to bear in a very short span of time. I mean, you don't need to learn one subject over another forever to be on top of it. So now there are just a couple of questions, I think, that I'll ask you, that people in chat have put. You could. One question, of course, is about how do you bring about a synergy of Sarkar, Bazaar, and Samaj? Because I mean, they could be like ships in the night, pass by each other with their own world view and language. How does someone in business or someone from civil society communicate to a policymaker? How do we get at that common communicative capacity? So that's one question. You can come back to it and answer that. And then I think there was a question about whether we should, reform. I think the UPSC exam reforms, I think the National Capacity Development Commission is engaged in. And so we can't get into details about whether there should be a paper in public policy or some public management. In that, we leave it to that Capacity Development Commission to address that. But this question about connecting the three spheres, modes of communication, really. How does one talk to the other to influence and to get good policies? So I'd like both of you to address that question.
I think what you said earlier, Sudarshan, you made a very good case for why public policy education should also go down to school level, right? I think the point that you were making in terms of how important this is and how interdisciplinary that is, right? So I think we have civics classes and courses at the school level, but some of these ideas are not being talked about at that level, which I think is a perfect time in the life of a student or a citizen, if you want to put it that way, to come across some of these ideas and begin to think about them, right? So I agree with you that the importance that you are highlighting is not just for somebody pursuing a career after college and looking for a postgraduate degree and a job, but also I think for citizenship itself. And that has to happen within the school system. I think we should think about as an association, what can we do together to be able to take these ideas to the education boards and see what can be done to spread this understanding of public policy at the high school level. I think the question that you asked really is the proverbial million-dollar question, right? How do we bring about synergy across Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar? I think two things I found in my sort of experience at Center for Civil Society earlier and now at ISPP is that one, I think aligning on the goal. Often there's a huge dissonance among where we want to get or go, right? So if you have some broad alignment, right, this is where we want to reach, then I think it's easier to align ourselves on the means. Now, when I say goal, I don't mean just broad idea of giving education to every child. I mean, that's the goal at one level, right? But it has to be a little more concrete than that, right? So something, and I think one way to think about that is looking at the means to achieve that goal and having a debate around the means. And that's where I think Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar obviously are the three tools in a policymaker's toolbox, right? I can use one of those tools or a combination of those tools to solve the problem. So I think that's one. I think second thing I found what is important is the understanding of the view of the poor. So in many of my conversations, even about, we talk about evidence-based public policy, you bring all this evidence of RCTs and many other things which are being done, right? But at the end of the day, I think when it all comes down to is how does the other person think about the poor and the capacity of the poor, right? And often you would find, I used to ask this question about the Bihar bicycle program where Nitish Kumar gave not bicycles to high school going girls, but actually gave them money to buy a bicycle, right? And many people sort of laughed at the idea at the time that, if you give money to the poor parents, what would they do with it, right? And most people predicted, and even today, when I ask this question to the audience, most of them raised their hands and almost 90% of them would say, yes, of course, father would use up the money for drink, right? And very few are going to buy bicycles. But no, we have evidence that more than 80% of them actually bought bicycles with the money that was given to them, right? So I find that the view of the poor and the capacity of the poor, because many of these programs and ideas ultimately boil down to the large masses that we want to help, right? And of course, poverty is one of the common denominator for the large number of people. And I find that if you are able to address that view of the poor and their capacity to lead the life of their own choice, then many of these issues around Sarkar, Samaj, Bazaar begin to get resolved. The one reason why people feel that Sarkar is the only solution is because they think of the poor as helpless people who can only be saved by the Mai Baap, right? And therefore, I think we get into this tussle in many of these problems.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is almost a philosophical question for me, because it is really about understanding the dharma of each of these kind of three elements between the society, market, and government. And So to begin with, I think we need to have that very clear understanding of what exactly is the role of these three things. What is the role of the state? What is the role of market? What is the role of society? That is the first part. Second is to understand when these things can fail. I think where free market fundamentalists will fail is that they don't address the idea that markets can fail. Where, for example, government proponents will fail is that they don't understand the idea that governments can fail and sometimes fail spectacularly. Right. And the worst part is, I think most people don't even understand what is the role of society in bringing about change. There is very vague talk about it, but I don't think it goes into this idea. We can take, again, some examples to kind of drive home this point. You can think of, for example, I've already touched upon this, but the government already does a whole bunch of things that the market should be doing. It has no business to be in there. But leave that aside. But the market sometimes does what the government has to be doing, which is actually suggest policies. Parth, for example, talked about consultants and how consultants are actually forming policies and so on. So, in places like Russia, of course, it's a nightmare that you have private armies. But we are not there yet, so that's good. But I want to focus on the society bit because I think that is the least understood. There are certain problems where I think only society can solve. Government and markets can aid it, but it can't be. For me, the biggest example for this is female labor force participation rate. If you look at why India's female labor force participation rate is so low, yes, there are some government angle to it. Can we, for example, provide better safety such that women can travel to and back to work? And so that is one set of things that the government can do. But there's also a set of things that market can do, maybe, committing to be an equal opportunity hirer and so on. That is the thing. But the biggest change has to be at a societal level. That is, society has to change to say, okay, we want more women in the workforce. We are completely not just okay with it, but we encourage more women to work and bringing about that change in that sense, right? Because we've seen that, economic literature says there's a J-shaped curve and all of that. But we don't have to get into that. But for me, the fundamental thing here is a social problem. So understanding, and this is a framework. The market, society, government trilogy is a framework that you can use to understand what is the role of each of these things and where can it fail, right? So if the government tries to intervene too much in the market, it can fail. It can have disastrous outcomes. If markets try to intervene in something like society, it can have disastrous outcomes and so on. So I think we have to understand what is the role, where can it fail, how can we mitigate that? I think that is something that has to be the focus.
Okay, now Manoj, there are a couple of interesting questions. Can we overshoot time by some minutes? And so how many minutes?
Yeah, probably we can go for 10 more minutes if the speakers agree. Because I've been told that there are some individuals also would like to raise their voices. So
But I have access only to chat. There's no question answer.
Yeah, so the team will unmute them and probably they can raise or type in the question.
Okay,
saying,
so
I would like to speak.
let
Go
me
ahead,
kick
10
off
minutes.
with this, with some question that, one question is about, the ocean of knowledge is so vast, but then we have artificial intelligence that get at high speed, connect multiple disciplines, multiple points of view. And so there's one question that you may wish to address is about how we actually embrace and make use of artificial intelligence rather than have policies and legislation that tries to ban it, because that's one of those things that you can't ban. It will get into every person's mobile phone willy-nilly. So that's one question. And the other one is about, you see, a missing element in much of our public policy, if you interpret the word public to mean people at large, or the relevant public, meaning people living in Bangalore city, people living on the coastline, those are the relevant publics, and they are people, ordinary people. Whereas the corporates have enormous influence. They finance elections. Politicians depend on them, and they kind of push for policies that are in their interest and not necessarily in the interest of the public. So another question I want to address to both of you is, how do you, in making public policy, genuinely involve the public? In other words, Parth knows that civil society, the public could be a synonym for civil society. But how do you, in making policy, get this feedback or get, I have to tell you that in China once, the Chinese wanted, when I was in UNDP, wanted to learn something about the Bangalore report card. And I said, why are you going to want to waste your time about the Bangalore report card? It's published every year. The Bangalore citizens say that the services of the Bangalore Corporation are atrocious and terrible, and nothing changes, nothing happens. The newspapers report it, and that's the end of it. So why do you guys want it? And they said, no, because we now rely on the party secretary to give a verdict on how the local government is performing. The party secretary is an individual and he can be biased and subjective. The Bangalore report card gets the feedback directly from citizens. It is more objective than the party secretary. And if the report comes out badly, we will remove all of the people in the local government, lock, stock, and barrel. And then the man said to me, if your definition of democracy is that the rulers must be accountable to the ruled, and if the ruled are unhappy with the rulers, and therefore the rulers must change, we do it, what do you do in your democracy? See, that was a question that made me think. So that's another question about how can the public have a better say, compared to big business in policy making. Artificial intelligence and vis-a-vis big business and corporates, how do you get the public to impact public policy? Two thoughts from the questions on chat.
Anupam, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I'll take the second one, which is how do you get the public more involved? They've also referred to crony capitalism, so I think we should also take that head on because that seems to be one of the biggest challenges we're facing today. And I don't think we can emphasize enough on the role of institutions in curbing things like crony capitalism. And when I say institutions, I mean a proper set of government institutions, independent institutions, which can do that. And as the public, we should ask and demand that these institutions are free, they are independent, and they actually have some tooth while going after doing their jobs. That's one part. But how do you get the public more involved? I think, see, there are certain sections where the government is actually seeking active inputs. They're seeking inputs in terms of public consultations. They put things out for public consultations. Sometimes TRAI does it, TRAI does it, or MeitY does it, etc. And in those occasions, I think we should respond to it. And because these are things that, the privacy law, for example, we should, because it affects each one of us, it's our data, we should respond to it whether we truly understand this or not. And that's where also I think the role of intermediaries come in. So many of think tanks / advocacy groups, etc., are essentially intermediaries. They can help simplify the problem. They can present that problem to people and say, if you are, if you are convinced by our arguments, please respond in such a way. So I think the role of intermediaries is also extremely important. And then you need, I've said this before, but you need an engaged citizenry. But that engaged citizenry need not be at the level of, engaging with or trying to recommend foreign policy to, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. But it can start with, there are many times that, for example, Bangalore traffic police will actually call out for consultation, saying, we want to solve this problem. They say, I don't know how many people actually end up going there. So you can start small like that. That makes you a better involved citizen, and then you can take it up much higher notches. Artificial intelligence, I think it's going to disrupt every part of our lives, and I think it will also disrupt this. And if you're clever, we can use that in a clever way. We can actually make it in, use that artificial intelligence to have interdisciplinary inputs into policymaking.
Parth?
Yeah, I think in terms of how to get public involved in public policy, I think very important question. And I think one way we have been trying to do at ISPP, right? So actually the diploma or degree or certificate that our graduates get is called policy, design, and management. So design thinking, we have put at the center of the curriculum in some sense, right? And what I realized, of course, all of us know that how elite-driven control the policy-making process is, right? So people like us are sitting around in these rooms and making those decisions, right? And people at the grassroots have hardly any say in the matter. Even large NGOs which have been working in the area for long years, even they don't really have a much say in what policies are being made, right? So I think to counter that, we have to bring the public into the picture. And one way to do that is to train our policy professionals to think from the eyes of the citizen, as well as the eyes of the expert, right? So I think one of the things we hopefully can do for all our students and graduates, right, irrespective of the programs, is to bring that understanding and salience, all right, about, and I found the design thinking is one way to achieve that more systematically, because it just forces you by design to think about the customer, right? To think from the customer's eyes, from customer's experience, right? Whether the customer would actually like it or not, would benefit or not, right? So I think that perspective of focusing on citizen, of course, private sector focuses on customer, we are focusing on citizens. That is very important way in which to bring that alignment between role of public and the public policy, right? So design thinking is, we found, an important tool to bring about that perspective among the people we are putting out, who will be working in public policy domain in the future, right? And the second, I think we talk about creating public policy platforms. So Anupam pointed out the government does now ask for a feedback, right? And many of the bills which are in the parliament are now put out for comment from the public. But we have been making those comments for the last 20 years, right? At the Center for Civil Society, and I'm sure many others do. You don't even know whether they actually saw your comment, let alone there is no response to it, not even a thank you that comes automatically, right? And there's no way to figure out what happened to whatever. And I think more importantly, when you made a comment, Sudarshan, or others made a comment, I don't get to know what comments you made, right? So we are, all of us ultimately are engaging with that particular law or a policy or regulation, which is being we are giving feedback on. But we have no idea who in the country are interested in that, who are making comments, what kind of comments are being made. So my one suggestion I had for a long time for the ministry and for the parliament secretariat, at least put those comments on public domain, right? Even that would be a great service to public policy process for us to know who other people are interested in this area and what point of views they bring to the table. And that could be a great learning platform for our students in the policy school.
Okay, Manur, you said that we could ask some of the people to, Tanveer has made a very interesting observation. It's intriguing, and I want it to be explained. Publicness of public policy is something more than just people or civil society. So publicness of public policy, can we ask Tanveer to explain that aphorism? Is he there? Well,
is it done? Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, we can. Go ahead.
Good evening to everyone. It's such a nice, feeling is nice that we are participating in this webinar. Okay, start my. Yeah, so what I wanted to say is that, I think it's not proper to assume that, civil society, market, and state, all these exist as a blob, as in silos. There's a lot of intermeshing and intermixing in all these three areas, right? So one is this aspect. The second one, which I wanted, basically, which I wanted to talk about, is that when we talk about public policy, somehow we tend to forget about the publicness of public policy, and the publicness is basically defined is the manner in which we share the sovereignty of public policy making, right? Which means that public policy is always made on somebody's behalf, right? It is not made for self-interest, right? It is made for somebody's behalf. So the agency involved in public policy has to think about that, on whose behalf the policies are made, right? And there comes the idea of sharing sovereignty. The second aspect of publicness, what I mean is, when I say that it's beyond just simply people, because the moment when we say public should be involved, the policy experts tend to be at the hierarchical, at a superior position, and public at the inferior position. The moment when we say that they should be involved and they should be engaged, right? So therefore, the second aspect of publicness is also about whose interest is being served. That is the interest part of it. So when we talk about public policy, we need to understand that who benefits, whose interest is being served. And the third aspect of publicness is about the whole question of accessibility. The organization, government openness. What we understand of publicness is the degree of openness to the organization, in terms of not just simply space, but also information, also about how the processes, of policy making is shared. Right. So these are the aspects which are very, very important, which tends to go beyond civil services, civil society, and just simply, making people as inert, inactive, always being ask them to come, we are there, come and join us, and have a because participatory public policy making has a very larger canvas, and essentially at the bottom is that, at the crux is that we need to share sovereignty, which nobody is ready to do that. Government, not at all. As Professor Sudarshan always say, that it's knowledge proof. It's The government is knowledge proof. It doesn't want to share anything. So it is here where the whole problem lies. So publicness is about resistance, about discussion on power also. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. So now, yeah, no, one of the things that we try to do in most schools that involve in public policy is to get our students to communicate with ordinary people and value the knowledge that they have. You see, as you mentioned, you use the word hierarchy, Tanvir, that somehow the expert has the superior knowledge, and the poor woman in a village, is dismissed as generally ignorant. And so one of the things we need to get young people to understand is that knowledge can come from multiple sources, and knowledge is valuable in itself and for itself, and that not to look at the person and say, oh, as we say, show me the person and I will tell you the rule. Show me the person and I'll say whether I'll take you seriously or not. I think we need to overcome that, and young people should be able to do it. And increasingly, my concern, and I think I have to bring it out because we are in a university with a School of Public Policy situated in the fields, farmers around in Haryana. It's a struggle for me to get students to be able to communicate to the village women around outside it. For those women, the students in my school at this university are like some creatures in a zoo. They're very strange. They dress very differently. They behave very differently. They seem to come from another planet. Um, and then there are these people, right? And so the idea that somehow you come from privileged backgrounds, you pay high fees, therefore you know it all, and not value the knowledge that farmer has. I mean, if you want to address the farm burning problem, I think you should talk to many more farmers. They'll tell you why it is that they understand the pollution that it's causing, but you'll have to understand their point of view. So one of the things that we have to do is to increase the component of what you might call experiential education, and to enable students who join a public policy program to be able to converse and learn from multiple constituencies. They can go to chambers of commerce, they can go to NGOs, but they can also go to a village home and drink tea with a woman and learn something. So I think this is something we need to, and I think, Parth, you made a very important point that a way to do this, a way to culture students to doing this should begin at school. Because at some point, catch them young, they say, and that will make a difference. So any last observations from the two of you for our panelists, and any of the questions that might interest you in the chat? And then we'll end up. That's in another.
Maybe I just, I think in terms of the publicness of the public policy, right? Often, I think, as Tanvir pointed out, we may rely on asking for solutions from them. But what I learned is that even defining a problem, which is worth addressing through public policy, should come from the citizens themselves. Right? There's a classic story of this young activist who goes to a village, sees that women of the village have to walk 3-4 kilometers every day to get access to water, which has been a situation in many parts of India. So he uses influence to install a hand pump in the village, thinking that now women will be able to get water within the village, won't have to walk, right? After a few months, he is coming, visiting the village, hoping that women will be happy and will welcome him for providing them this hand pump, right? Turns out that women of the village are quite angry about the hand pump, right? So from his point of view, that was a solution. That's the problem, was the going to the water body, collecting water for women. As you can easily imagine, as we think about it, those 2-3 hours were the only private time they had, right? Otherwise, they're always stuck within the house, right? They can't talk to each other. This is the only time they can talk to each other, share their stories, empathize with what other women are going through in their own lives, right? So for them, having to fetch water for 3-4 kilometers was not really a top problem. Of course, it was, I'm sure, a problem for them, right? But if you ask them what is you want to get solved first, probably the other things they would have wanted to get solved from the resources of the public, right? And through public policy, possibly, than solving the problem of the water fetching, right? So quite often, I think we realize that even the definition of problem is also expert driven, right? And that is where I see is the most fundamental challenge that we face in public policy.
Anupam, last word.
Yeah, maybe very briefly, I think, yeah, my idea is that when we talk about publicness of public policy, I think it's important for, well, the public to be genuinely involved in the policy making process. And most people believe that if they vote once in 5 years, that's their job done, in terms of even state elections, but that's their job done. Voting is the end of their participation in the democratic process. But given that today there exists social media, there exists a whole bunch of other avenues, I think people should be a lot more deliberative on how they involve. Each time they support, let's say, a party over a policy, they're actively contributing towards bad policies. Each time they don't raise their voice against something and saying, no, this is not good for us, I think this should be better, then they're just being silent. They're abetting bad policy. So I think in all of those ways, each person has a role to play. Given that there is voice, you can write, you can, there are blogs, there are videos that you can make. The avenues are endless today, which didn't exist maybe 20 years ago. But today the avenues are endless. From creating YouTube reels to Instagram shorts to something else, you can actually do some of the, I think I got that wrong, but anyway, you can do some of those things to actually persuade people, right? And say, and demand from the government. And if there's enough people, government will listen, or should listen at least. Oh, that's the hope. So yeah, I think all of us have a bigger role to play.
Hey, thank you, Manoj. You got to, the APPE has to organize many more, because we have many good questions, very good reflections, particularly on how do you evaluate a policy? When do you say a policy is good? Those sorts of questions come up, and we need, many more of these occasions when we can explore this together. And it's great to have a very participative, audience, and to my thanks to the two wonderful panelists that we've had, and thanks to the APPE, to CPPR, and to you, Manoj.
Thank you, Manoj, for putting together a great program.
Thank you, Professor Sudarshan, Dr. Parth, and Professor Anupam, for enlightening us on this afternoon. And thank you, the lovely participants. You can look into the recordings and you can share the recordings of this on the YouTube. We'll share a link with you. But a big gratitude to Dhanu, April, Shruti, and Paul, and many others in CPPR, and the two silent interns of APP who's working there based in Kochi. And all of us are volunteers in this cause, Parth, Professor Sudarshan, me, and Dhanu, who are members of APP, would like to encourage. Many of you have written to us so in the chat. Look at our website, and if you're interested to promote the cause, or you have a lovely idea for a discussion beyond webinar, maybe ideas to take public policy education back in your cities or campuses, write to us. And welcome to the association. I invite you to be a member. So thank you, and have a great evening to all of you. And thank you once again, the panelists and Professor Sudarshan.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye, everyone.